Hey AP Euro, it is Mr. Walker, and today I'll be making videos about our absolutism chapter. Now, our absolutism chapter, there's a lot going on in it. It starts with the 30 Years' War, and then it does the English Civil War to the Glorious Revolution, and then it's about the theory of absolutism, and two of the major absolutist rulers that we ended up comparing this year were Louis XIV, the Sun King of France, and then Peter the Great of Russia. And so, and we also looked at what does absolutism mean and how it controls various aspects of society. So with this one, I'm going to start with the 30 Years' War, and that's what this video will be about, okay? But it's in context of all those other things. So I guess I'll start with, I'll just put it this way, a timeline. So, we've got 1648 to, in this period 2, all the way to 1815. And at least with absolutism, you've got the 30 Years' War ends here. And so therefore it begins when, let's carry the one is in 1618. Okay, and so this is the 30 Years' War. 30 Years' War. And then to put the other one in perspective, the English Civil War and Glorious Revolution. 1649 is when King Charles I is executed. Charles I executed. And then the other date that I remember that has to do with the English Civil War and Glorious Revolution is 1688. 1688 is the Glorious Revolution. Glorious Rev. Okay. In terms of absolutism, with Louis XIV, I always remember that he was a boy king during the 30 Years' War. And he goes all the way until he's the longest serving monarch. And so Louis XIV, Louis XIV, remember, don't get this number right, Louis XIV, 14, right? This is the Sun King. He's there from this period. He goes all the way to, I think it's 1715. And then I think it's 1644. Something like that. 1644 to 1715 is at the end of the 30 Years' War during the French phase. And he goes all the way to 1715. Of course, there's 100 years in between 1715 and 1815. And then Peter the Great, he overlaps with Louis XIV. He goes from 1680 something, I want to say 1685 to 1725. That's Peter the Great. Peter the Great of Russia. And so in my absolutism dates, I'm thinking 30 Years' War is in this period. The English Revolution, Civil War, and Glorious Revolution is also in the 1649 date of Charles I's head popping off to 1688 with the Glorious Rev, and then absolutism in France with Louis XIV over that period, and then in Russia with Peter the Great from 1685 to 1725. That's Peter the Great in Russia. And so we've got Russia, France, England, and 30 Years' War is Central Europe, Holy Roman Empire. And so this covers that area. If you're thinking about this time period and wondering what's going on in certain places, you've got the Holy Roman Empire, has the 30 Years' War during this time. And again, it takes a while to recover from the 30 Years' War. In England, during this time, you have Civil War and Glorious Revolution here, which creates a constitutionalism, which we'll talk about later. And then in France, during this period, you have the rise of absolutism. Throughout this whole period, it goes until the French Revolution in 1789, and they're just Louis XIV, 15, and then Louis XVI. He's the guy whose head pops off in 1793. And then you've got, in Russia, this is the rise of the Russian Empire. Peter the Great, think of him as the person who really starts that off. And those dolls that I have, the little seed inside my Russia stacking nesting dolls, is Peter the Great, and he's considered that absolutist ruler who, if you go deep inside Putin, is there. And so there you've got Russia. Okay, 30 Years' War. If you remember, you guys memorized a whole sequence based on the 30 Years' War. There were four phases of the 30 Years' War, and 4 phases, and those phases were the Bohemian phase. The second one was the Danish phase. The third one was the Swedish phase. And the fourth one was the French phase. And the way in which we consider the 30 Years' War is it starts as a religious war. It ends as a political war. So in the beginning, it's about religion, and that religion is specifically Catholics versus Protestants, especially Calvinists. And by the end, it's nation states fighting each other. Okay? And, remember, here's one, the first phase, the defenestration of Prague, representatives from Ferdinand II thrown out the window from a meeting in Prague after they make demands from Bohemians, convert from Calvinism to Catholicism, and a mercenary army is raised by the Habsburgs in Austria to fight the Protestants. And the way we, thinking back to, it starts as this religious war, because if you remember, all the way back in 1555, the Peace of Augsburg, the nobles of the Holy Roman Empire could choose to either be Lutheran or Catholic. But since then, Calvinism has become very popular. And so there's nothing there about Calvinists. And so in the beginning, you have the Habsburgs, who are in Austria, who are winning and fighting against the Calvinists of the Holy Roman Empire. The second half are Habsburg losses. Okay, and I really doubt that there's going to be anything about getting specific into the 30 Years' War of the Bohemian phase, Danish phase, Swedish phase, or French phase. Just know that this represents Habsburg and the Austrian Habsburg victories, and then these are Austrian Habsburg losses here in the second phase. Okay, and so here you have the defenestration of Prague. During the Danish phase, the part that I wanted you to remember about this was sort of the horror of this war. You have mercenary armies. Remember, you don't have standing armies yet. They're people who are being promised money and spoils of war, and there's looting and rape and pillaging throughout the Holy Roman Empire. By the end of this, a third of the population of the Holy Roman Empire will have lost their lives. So one effect of the 30 Years' War, it decimates population. A third population dies of HRE, of the Holy Roman Empire, which turns, later into it's Germanic-speaking peoples, Austrian-speaking peoples, Czech-speaking peoples. It's Central Europe. That's sort of with the first half. The second half, during the Swedish phase, we learned about Gustavus Adolphus, the king of Sweden, and you have new military technology that's used during this time. One was mobile cannon. Here, let's go to here. During the Swedish phase, uses new military tactics. He has trained and disciplined soldiers instead of mercenary soldiers. He has technologies such as mobile cannon, musketeers, and paper cartridges. This is making warfare more more effective, and he's able to beat back the Habsburgs. Of course, he's killed in battle by the Duke of Wallenstein and his army. But later, Wallenstein's assassinated by his own leader, Ferdinand II, who feared his betrayal to France. And so the Swedish phase, also think about the horror of war. We saw that thing, the Swedish cocktail, where people are being forced, they're being tortured. And also think of the Swedish phase, think about the new technology that's being used. So we're in 1450, back at the 100 Years' War. At the end, you're using the longbow. Here, think about the musketeers, or the Three Musketeers. They're muskets, they're mobile cannons, and that's what's happening, the type of military that's being used here. Finally, the French phase. So up here, you have Calvinists fighting against the Catholics of the Habsburgs. The Danish are fellow Calvinists coming in to help the Calvinists of the Holy Roman Empire against the Austrian Habsburg Catholics. Here, the Swedish, they're Lutheran, and they're helping to fight against the Catholics. But here, when France comes into the war, they are Catholics also. Remember that France, on either side of France during this time, you got France here. Over here is Spain. That's also Catholic, but it's controlled by the Habsburg family, the Spanish Habsburgs. And then over here, the Holy Roman Empire. And you have the Austrian Habsburgs. The Austrian Empire is within the Holy Roman Empire. It's like the southern part of it. Up here you have Germanic-speaking peoples and nobles who have had that right to choose the religion of the region. But you also have Calvinists too. And the Austrian Habsburgs are Catholic. The Spanish Habsburgs are Catholic. Up here you have more Lutherans and Calvinists in this part of Europe. Over here is Switzerland, where you have the Calvinists, where John Calvin was. Up here you've got the Netherlands, which are Calvinists. And then you've got the English all the way up here, which is a mix of different religions, but we'll call them Anglican for now. We'll look at the English religion of the Civil War later. But here it starts as this, the Bohemian phase is in the Holy Roman Empire, this first phase. And then the Danish phase, these are Denmark's up here. They come down to fight. And then the Swedish phase, remember Sweden's up here, that's the third phase. These numbers are related to these numbers right here. And then finally the fourth phase is France getting involved. And at this time, France, the fourth phase, or the French phase, is that even though Louis XIV is the boy king, oh yeah, I've got his picture over here. Here's Louis XIV, the boy king. France is ruled by two cardinals, Cardinal Mazarin and Cardinal Richelieu. It first starts with Richelieu and then goes to Cardinal Mazarin. And they're making policies to increase the power of the king and lessen the power of nobles. And they are not, they're not thinking necessarily about religion, even though they're cardinals. They're thinking about power. Similar to Machiavelli, they're not making choices based on religion, they're making choices based on power. And during this time, they're going to not fight on the side of Catholics, they're going to fight for their nation, for France, against Habsburg influence, the Habsburgs in Austria and the Habsburgs here. And they are taking advantage of this situation while this war is going on to get more territory here. This is when Alsace and Lorraine, when France grabs those territories that will later be taken away from them in the Franco-Prussian War in 1871. But here in the French phase of the 30 Years' War, they're expanding their territory. And so the French are victorious. The final part of the 30 Years' War is the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. And the Peace of Westphalia, some of the conditions of it, or the effects of this war, is that now the nobles and princes of the Holy Roman Empire, they can be Lutheran, Calvinist, or Catholic. Before they could only be Lutheran or Catholic. Now they can also add Calvinism to the choices that they can be. German states become independent from the control of the Holy Roman Empire. So in my map here of the Holy Roman Empire, the Germans who live up here in these German states up in the northern part of the Holy Roman Empire, they're independent. And so the Holy Roman Empire basically has fallen apart at the end of this war. Then you have the Austrian Habsburgs down there, and then you have German states that are up in here, including one that starts growing in power called Prussia, which is right up here. All right, and so now this represents the breakup of the Holy Roman Empire and more independence for German nobles. Remember, this doesn't mean independence for German people or German-speaking people. They're still serfs. They're still tied to the land, and nobles have a lot more privileges here than they do in other parts of Europe. Again, Germany's lost a third of its population. It's the most devastating conflict in Europe until World War I in 1914. France gains territory, right, Alsace-Lorraine, as well as other territories. The Dutch are finally independent from Spain, and Switzerland is independent. So during this fight, as the Spanish Habsburgs are involved and the Austrian Habsburgs are involved, remember, Spain controlled the Netherlands, and the Netherlands finally becomes free of Spain during the 30 Years' War. In 1648, Netherlands gets their independence also as part of this treaty. And the Dutch throw off the Catholics of Spain, and these are Calvinists here, and they actually have a religiously tolerant place, and we'll look at that later. And that religious tolerance brings other Protestants and Jews to the Netherlands, where they can practice their religion, and also they become a very wealthy country too, because of the bankers, because of the merchants, because of the growing middle class. Okay, Dutch are independent from Spain, Switzerland's independent. A balance of power between nation states exists in Europe until the French Revolution. So this balance of power, meaning that the Austria and France and Spain and England and Prussia and Netherlands, they're all agree not to let one country become more powerful than the other. At least in practice, this is what they say. Although during the 1700s, there are lots of wars between these countries. Louis XIV is always trying to expand his territory. There are fights between Prussia and Austria over succession. France and Spain fight, and England and France are at conflict fairly often. But that's the end of the 30 Years' War. It starts as religious war, and it ends as a political war. And so the rest of this time period between 1648 to 1815, you're not going to see religious conflict. You're mostly going to see conflict among nation states. And that's what really defines this period as conflicts between these kingdoms, between these monarchs that are created by the end of the 30 Years' War. Okay.